Okay, hi everyone. My name is Tina. If you were here last weekend, you probably know. I'm currently a high school senior, and today I'm here to talk about the SAT essay. And my friend Crystal is going to be joining me, and she'll introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Crystal. I go to school with Tina at Windsor. I scored a 24 out of 24 on the essay when I took it, and next year I will be a prospective English major at the Barnard College of Columbia University.
Okay, so here's how we're going to organize today's session. First, I'm going to be going over the structure of the SAT essay, and I'm going to talk about how it's scored, the rubric for a perfect score, and the typical prompt format. Then I'm going to talk about all the elements that a good essay must include. Then I'm going to talk about how your essay should be structured and how to study for the essay section.
I'll talk about how you should actually approach the essay during the test itself, as well as analyze the essay that I actually wrote when I took the test. Lastly, me and Tina will go over some elements that you guys can use in your writing, and then we'll leave some time for questions at the end.
Okay, so you'll get 50 minutes total for the SAT essay section should you opt to take it. It's optional and you can take it with the general SAT. So you can choose either to take the SAT with the essay or without the essay. And if you do take it with the essay, it comes after you take the general SAT. You actually can't take the SAT essay by itself. So if you want to try again for like a better essay score, you're going to have to take the whole SAT over again. And you get 50 minutes exactly. So, how it's scored is that two different readers will read your essay separately, and then they will rate your essay on a scale of 1 to 4, with 4 being the best and 1 being the poorest, on three different categories, which is reading, analysis, and writing. That means that the full score you can actually get is a 24, and that's if both readers give you a 4 out of 4 on all three categories. So you'll be given a prompt and a passage. And basically, what your essay needs to do is it needs to argue how the author actually proves their claim through rhetorical techniques and elements. And the prompt will remain the same regardless of what the passage is like. So you'll always see these two boxes, and they'll say, as you read the passage below, consider how the author uses evidence, such as facts or examples, to support claims, reasoning to develop ideas and to connect claims and evidence, stylistic or persuasive elements such as word choice or appeals to emotion to add power to the ideas expressed. And then you'll be instructed to write an essay in which you explain how the author builds an argument to persuade his or her audience that whatever the argument is. In your essay, analyze how the author uses one or more of the features listed in the box to strengthen the logic and persuasiveness of his or her argument. Be sure that your analysis focuses on the most relevant features of the passage, which means that you should be talking about something that might show up 2 or 3 times and not just once. And if there are elements that are recurring, you want to talk about those rather than a rhetorical element that might only appear once in the passage. So it adds that your essay shouldn't explain whether or not you actually agree with the author's claims, but it's about how the author actually builds an argument to persuade his audience. So these are the guidelines or the sort of rubric that the College Board gives for a full scoring essay. I'm not going to go over them one by one, but what you need to know is that for analysis, they're looking for the ability to pull quotes directly from a passage and do some close analysis. They want you to break down quotes directly taken from the passage and do work with that. For the reading section, they want to see that you actually understand the passage and you actually understand what the author is trying to argue, which means that through your writing, you should show that a very clear understanding of what the passage is actually about. And then finally, for writing, that's along the lines of good grammar, good spelling, good punctuation, and being very eloquent, clear, and concise. So now I'm going to talk about the elements that a good essay should always include. First is a thesis, and it should establish your argument, and it should be at the end of your intro paragraph. So here's an example of a good thesis. I'm taking this from a practice SAT essay that I actually did in 50 minutes. So through employing appeal to emotion, selective word choice, and juxtaposition, King powerfully presents his reasons for his opposition against American intervention in the Vietnam War to his audience. As you can see here, in a thesis, I've included all three things I'm going to talk about: appeal to emotion, selective word choice, and juxtaposition. And I'm also arguing that you can see that my argument is that King can make his argument really strong by these three elements. And basically, all SAT essay theses will kind of look something along the lines of that. So you also need a really well organized essay, which means that for each paragraph, a clear purpose or topic is established, usually by the first sentence, which would be your topic sentence. Each body paragraph should stay relevant to that topic that you're talking about and that you established in your topic sentence. So you don't want to go off topic, and you don't want to talk about other elements in a paragraph that's dedicated to a certain element. And finally, here's an example of a good topic sentence. As you can see, it's pretty simple. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy, but perhaps King's most powerful element is his usage of juxtaposition. So you know from this topic sentence alone that this paragraph is going to be all about how King uses juxtaposition in his passage. And the whole body paragraph should just be about that, about juxtaposition and how it advances his argument. Okay, you also want sentence variety. As you can see, my thesis was a pretty long sentence with a lot of clauses and commas, but my example topic sentence is a very short and simple sentence. So you want a variety. You want short sentences and long sentences to make your essay strong and your writing easier to read. Staying on one side or the other is not going to help. You don't want short sentences all the time, and you don't want long sentences all the time. And finally, you want clear, concise language, which is just good writing. And don't be redundant. Make sure you make your point clear, but you don't want to say something three different times, but have the same point. So you want to be clear, but you don't want to be redundant. All right, you also need smooth transitions between points, and this can be as easy as inserting a transitional adverb in there. So here we have a list of good sentence starters. If you're coming to a conclusion, you can use therefore, hence, or thus, and or in conclusion. And if you're sort of advancing something, you can say furthermore, um, moreover, likewise. And if you're trying to draw a contrast, you can say in contrast, and however, although. And if you're giving an example, for instance, and for example are always good. So here's a list that you can look back on if you're a little stuck. Oftentimes a good transition is just sticking one of these words in between two sentences. And here's an example of me using that. So as you can see, I have a whole sentence where I'm talking about by juxtaposing liberties in Southeast Asia with the liberty being sought by Black men at home in places like East Harlem, blah, 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 blah. And then additionally, King talks of how he and others, and then quote. So you can see that just inserting that additionally there really smoothly connects the two ideas. I'm switching from one quote to another, but it's pretty smooth, and that all you need is that one additionally. So this is true for the SAT essay. You don't want to have anything less than 2.5 handwritten pages. And usually you don't want to exceed 4 pages, but to be honest, I doubt that you'll actually be able to exceed 4 pages. 50 minutes is not a lot of time to write, and handwriting is pretty slow. So, but always try to at least aim for about, I'd say 3.5 pages. That's probably the best length. And you don't want to be anywhere less than 2.5 pages. Finally, you always want to have legible handwriting. You do not get to type the SAT essay. It really doesn't have to be neat, but it should be easily readable by anyone. If they can't read your handwriting, it's not going to count as part of your essay. It's not the grader's responsibility to find out what you're trying to say. So if you can't even read your own handwriting, then the grader's not going to be able to read it, and they'll just, skip over that chunk. Along the lines of this, you can cross things out, and if you cross something out in your essay, the grader won't count it as part of your essay. But keep in mind that if you're sort of trying to add sentences back in with little arrows and little carrots, that they have to be really clear as to where they're pointing to. And if you have something like smushed in the margins, you want to make it as clear as possible what the sentence is and where it's trying to go. Because if they can't read it, again, they're not going to count it. But if you, since you're short on time, don't erase, just strike things through. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about how your essay should be structured now. So first, you have your intro paragraph, and the only two things you really need in the intro paragraph is an introduction sentence, which includes your author, the piece you're going to be talking about, and sort of establish the objective. And then finally, you have your thesis at the end, which is your argument and the 3 points you're going to make in that order. I recommend literally just a 2-sentence intro paragraph when it comes to the SAT essay. That's all you really need. And you don't want to waste too much time on your intro paragraph. As you can see here, I've highlighted my introduction sentence in purple and my thesis in yellow, which you saw earlier. That's enough. That's like a good intro paragraph for the SAT essay. You don't need to be giving your best writing for this. You just need to sort of hit the requirements of the SAT essay. And all you need are these 2 sentences. So moving on to the body paragraphs, you always want to establish what the body paragraph is about in your topic sentence, like I talked about earlier. Here I've highlighted them in pink, so you can take a look at that. I'm not going to actually read the essay. Your body paragraphs should be exactly in the order that you find them stated in the thesis. So as you can see in my thesis, I've said through employing appeal to emotion, selective word choice, and juxtaposition, blah, blah, blah. So then you can see that my first body paragraph is about appeal to emotion. King's use of appeal to emotion adds a powerful element of pathos to his argument. And then the second thing I mentioned in my thesis is selective word choice. So my topic sentence for my second body paragraph is King also employs powerful word choice. And then lastly, you have perhaps King's most powerful element is his usage of juxtaposition. When in your body paragraphs, you should be pulling quotes directly from the passage and doing close analysis. I've highlighted some instances where I actually pull quotes from the text in blue and analysis that follows in red. But basically, this means that you should be sort of copying a few sentences or phrases word for word from the actual passage and talking about that. If you run out of time, you can do a bit of paraphrasing, but ideally you want to be mostly pulling quotes when you can. And I recommend at least finding 2 different pieces of evidence per paragraph or point, which means that it should be something you talk about. Sorry, one of the points you talk about in your body paragraph shouldn't be happening only once in the passage, like I talked about earlier. Again, you don't have to maybe quote 2 long chunks. You can paraphrase, and that can be your second piece of evidence. But you want to find as many pieces of evidence as possible for each body paragraph. But since you don't have enough time to write a lot, I recommend 2. And this is very important, but it might seem straightforward, but you always want to include in your analysis or in the sentence after that close analysis of the quote of how these quotes or things you've taken out, how that actually is relevant, how that actually connects back to your thesis and your main argument. So basically, you want to be directly telling your reader how these words or how this word choice is actually advancing the argument. You have to state in what way is it powerful, is it compelling, and you need to give that to your reader directly. You don't want them to imply it. A lot of times I've seen essays where people sort of leave a sentence there and it's implied that some words will advance an argument, but you don't actually directly state this sort of has that effect. It actually does advance the argument. Finally, you have your conclusion, and all you really want to do here is to briefly reiterate your argument. You don't want to be too redundant with your thesis and your intro paragraph, but again, the intro and conclusion are not too important, so I wouldn't spend too much time on it. Your conclusion can be as simple as 1 sentence, I'd say max 2. You'd want to be spending most of your time writing the body paragraph. So in your conclusion, all you really need to do is to summarize what you just talked about, sort of recap your thesis, and that's it. Okay, so here's a list of tips that Crystal and I have sort of compiled for how to study for the essay section. First is to be familiar with the prompt. It's always the same, regardless of what passage you're given. Like we showed you earlier, it's always going to be that structure, so be familiar with that. Second is to know how to properly integrate quotes and practice close analysis if you feel like you don't already have adequate practice doing so. I know that for me and Crystal at our school, we do a lot of analytical writing. And if you feel like that's also the case for you, you might not need to do this. But if you feel like you don't really know how to integrate quotes and you haven't really done that sort of thing where you pull quotes from a passage and sort of break it down, you might want to do a little bit of extra practice before you dive into the SAT essay. Another piece of advice, always write by hand. Most of us are probably really used to typing up essays, and writing by hand is a lot slower than typing on a computer. So get used to writing by hand. So when you do practice rounds, I would recommend always writing by hand. Don't up your essays because you'll end up with longer and better quality essays that you actually can't produce in the actual test. And then always try to work under time pressure. If you're going to do a practice essay, give yourself exactly 50 minutes uninterrupted. Because if you take a break, sometimes your hand gets really tired. You might want to take a break. Um, it'll be fine for your practice round, but you won't get that luxury in the actual test. So you don't want to get used to that. And you always want to give yourself 50 minutes to work. For me, I actually gave myself 45 minutes just so I could feel like I had a little more room in the actual day of the test, but you can just do 50 minutes, that's fine also. And then finally, you'll find that after you do a lot of practice essays, you might realize that you're repeating a lot of sentences or the structure of sentences where you can sort of just plug in sort of the author's name or the point you want to make. Keep those in mind because it's actually pretty helpful. You might find yourself blanking on the day of the test and you're sort of anxious, you'll be nervous. And if you can sort of pull those sentences pretty fast from your brain, that'll help you a lot. I don't recommend sort of memorizing a format, but once you do practice essays enough, you'll find that you probably write your theses in a certain way, like, and you probably write your topic sentences in a similar way, and you can sort of reuse those tricks in on the day of the actual test because your graders aren't going to have read your practice essays. So, yeah, if you can find a template that works for you, you can sort of keep that in mind.
So now I'm going to be talking about how you should actually approach the test, how you should approach the essay when on the day of the test. So the first is the recommended how you should manage your time is that you should spend the first 5 minutes reading the prompt in the passage. Next, you want to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes outlining and planning your essay. Then the majority of your time should be focused on actually writing the essay, so 30 to 35 minutes. And lastly, try to leave yourself 5 minutes at the end to edit and revise. So when you're reading the passage, you first want to make sure that you highlight the prompt, the claim in the prompt, because that's the most important part of the prompt. The prompt is the same from passage to passage. You will always get the same text. So all you need to do is find the claim because that's the only thing that changes, highlight it, and then move on. That will also tell you what your passage is about, and it'll help you get a general sense before you even start reading. And then as you read, you want to highlight the most compelling evidence. So that means anything that the author says that you find particularly convincing or is especially relevant, you should highlight that, mark it up, make some kind of symbol. What I like to do was if I saw something that I wanted to use for my first body paragraph, I'd assign it like a star and I'd mark everything with a star. And then my second body paragraph would be a heart and so on and so on. And then as you're planning and outlining, you will group the evidence that you've marked up into 3 categories. So those categories could be word choice, they could be appeal to emotion, it could be facts and statistics. Those are just some examples, but those will be your body paragraphs. And then once you've kind of decided what your 3 categories are, you can also build your thesis from that. So for instance, if the 3 that I mentioned were my body paragraphs, my thesis could be something like through the usage of appeal to emotion, word choice, and facts and statistics, the authors effectively prove their claim, and that would be enough. Lastly, when you're writing, you want to try and spend roughly 10 minutes on each body paragraph. As Tina said before, the intro and conclusion are really short, and they also are not the bulk of the essay. They don't matter as much as your body paragraphs do, so make sure to spend as much time as you can on your body paragraphs, because added together, your intro and conclusion will be roughly 3 sentences, and that's not a whole lot in the entire essay. And then lastly, if you have the time to edit and revise, which you should, um, you should just go back to read for clarity and enhance word choice if possible. Again, like Tina said, make sure that you're crossing things out instead of erasing because that takes up more time. And also make sure that everything that you do add in is legible and that it goes where it should go. So this is the passage that I actually got when I took the SAT back in my junior year of high school. So you'll see highlighted in pink, that's the only thing that I highlighted from the prompt. It's just that the authors Lawrence Norden and Christopher Famaghetti, blah, 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 that outdated voting machines must be replaced. So that is the most important part of the prompt, and that's the only thing that matters to you. Everything else on this screen is the same from test to test, so you don't need to read any of this. You'll also see at the side, there's a little 1, 2, 3 with highlights. That's just a little key to say that the yellow highlights is quotes that I used for my first body paragraph, blue is for second body paragraph, and then green is third body paragraph. So I'm not going to read the actual essay itself, but it'll be on the screen here for you to go back and refer to if you'd like. So I'm just going to skip past it for now. So this is the actual essay that I wrote. I'm not going to go into depth here, but I'd just like to say that this is by no means any work that I would turn into my English teacher. It's not something that I consider good writing. It's not good writing. And that's to say that you don't need to be a fantastic writer to write for the SAT. And you also, even if you are a good writer, you don't need to be for the SAT because what they're looking for is just that you follow their rubric, not that you know how to use special phrases and nice transitions and flowy adjectives. Not that those things are bad, it's just that you don't have a lot of time, so you have to be really wise with how you use that time. So this is just the other half of the essay. You can go back to it if you'd like. I'm just going to quickly explain how my essay met the standards of the rubric. So first, for the analysis score, that they're looking for is that you understood what the essay was saying and that you knew how to pick out the specific evidence for your essay, and also that whatever you analyzed, the quotes that you pulled, you always linked it back to your thesis, which in turn answers the prompt. So the very first quote I pulled from my essay is my actual thesis. So I said, the three things that I chose were facts and examples, leading the reader through the argument logically, and then using vivid language. And so those are the three categories that I just used. But if you go back and read the essay, you'll see that there were more than just those three. So again, you can choose any other three. It doesn't have to be these specific three. And so this thesis just proves that I could identify three categories, three rhetorical strategies that the authors used for their essay. That's all that does. My next quote is something from my second body paragraph, I believe, and that's where I pulled out a comparison that the authors used. And so I said that the comparison was really helpful because they specifically chose to use a laptop, and laptops are something that the reader generally is very familiar with, and thus the reader is sure to understand whatever the argument is, whatever the author is arguing. And so it's important that whenever you analyze something, you always relate it back to the reader because that in turn relates it back to the thesis. Your thesis is that the reader is convinced by their argument, essentially. And so by constantly relating it back to the reader, you're really making sure that you're actually analyzing each of the quotes that you're pulling out. So for the reading score, that's to make sure that you understood the argument that the authors made and that you convey that in your essay. And so I pulled out a quote from my first body paragraph, and that's where I just picked out a study that the authors used. And that just proves that I understood what the essay was about. I pulled something that was relevant, and my essay was also relevant. Lastly, on the writing score, this is where they just want to make sure that you know how to use standard English conventions, that you have good grammar, that you understand what the basic structure of a 5-body paragraph essay is, and if you're particularly skilled at writing, if you know how to do anything super well. So really smooth transitions, really nice topic sentences, concluding sentences, that sort of thing. So you'll see what I pulled is actually my hook for my intro body paragraph, so to go back where I left off, that was just the writing score. And so I was just explaining that I actually wrote a hook for my first intro paragraph, and that's not necessary at all. You don't need to write a hook or anything a solid conclusion, because that's not as important as your body paragraphs. But if you have the time, it's nice to. So if you actually go back and see my essay, I was running out of time at the end because I spent a little more time on my introduction and my first body paragraph than I should have. And so in my conclusion is literally just one sentence, and I just restated my thesis. So you'll see like hooks and these like other extra details aren't necessary, but they're nice just if you have the time. So next, we're just going to quickly talk through some elements you can choose from. You'll see I've mentioned word choice and spastic statistics and data and other things. So this is just like a list for you guys to see what are potential elements that you could use. So the first one is word choice. So that's the one that I used my third body paragraph. Word choice is especially effective because essentially what it does is it accentuates the situation that the author is saying, or it kind of enhances the severity of a situation. So it mainly adds emphasis to the author's argument. And that's effective because it helps the reader understand just how serious the situation is, or just further understands the author's point, and that thus causes the argument to be more convincing.
Okay, the second element you can choose from is statistics and data. We've talked a bit about this, but anytime you see a number, a percentage, where the author sort of uses these numbers to support their argument, you can always talk about that. Statistics and data are particularly compelling because you can always talk about how the author is grounding their argument in real facts and figures, and the inclusion of these numbers makes it more likely for the reader to believe them. It gives you, it gives the author sort of more credibility that it's backed up by these numbers. And sometimes you can also talk about how big or small these numbers are, if the author is trying to stress that something is really big or really small. And you can talk about how including that number gives the reader a sense of how big that sheer magnitude is, or how sort of minimal a small number might be. So statistics and data is always a safe bet to talk about.
Another one is appeal to authority. That's where you kind of, where the author, if they do so, invokes authoritative, reputable sources. So that could be something like an author using a study from, say, Harvard. And that's reputable because Harvard is a trusted name and credible source. And so that just adds authority to the author's argument. The reader understands that the author is using trusted sources, that they've done their research, and thus they're more inclined to believe what the author is saying.
Another element you can talk about is making concessions. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive at first, but it's actually a strategy employed to actually strengthen someone's argument. So if you see that the author is making concessions, meaning that they're sort of admitting that the side they're taking might have certain drawbacks or flaws, you can actually talk about that. And it makes their argument stronger because by acknowledging these flaws, not only does the author seem more educated because they are aware of sort of both sides, they are aware of potential drawbacks and the strengths of their argument. It makes them, first of all, seem more educated on the issue, and therefore you're more likely to believe them, or you're more likely to trust what they say. And second of all, by making these concessions, they're showing that the confidence they have on their stance is very high. So they're saying basically, I know this has a drawback or this has certain flaws, but you know what, I'm still going to argue for my stance. And that conveys a sort of confidence to the reader that makes it more likely for the reader to also believe in whatever stance it is they're arguing.
So another one is analogies and comparisons, and this is where the author will compare something relevant to their argument to something else that is a little more general. So something as complicated as say a nuclear reactor is not quite accessible to the general public, or the students who take the SAT, and so maybe they compare that to something as simple as a computer. And so computers are something that are much more familiar to anyone. And thus, in doing so, they just help the reader understand their argument more. And that in turn just helps the reader be further convinced. But not all comparisons work like that. Some of them could just try to emphasize their points. So if an author really wants to convey just how big the sky is, they can make a comparison to, say, to I'm not quite sure, but essentially the point is that comparisons aren't always about trying to make the reader understand something. It could also be about just trying to emphasize a certain point.
Okay, another element you can always talk about is juxtaposition, and you might have noticed that in the sample essay included while we were talking about, I did use juxtaposition in one of my practice runs. So juxtaposition is when you sort of put two things right next to each other and they're somewhat parallel in a way, and there you can see like a really stark difference or a really stark contrast. And the use of juxtaposition is usually to highlight this sort of big discrepancy. And again, the two things you're comparing, or the two things that the author is comparing, is typically has some sort of parallel. So you could be talking about high schoolers in Europe versus high schoolers in America, and then there could be some sort of drastic difference between these two very similar groups of people. And the author is likely talking about that difference, and they're highlighting that difference by putting these two groups right next to each other. And you can always talk about juxtaposition and how it highlights a very severe difference between two groups.
So another one is challenging assumptions. That's where the author makes states an assumption that the reader has. So that could be something as simple as climate change is bad for the environment, or it could be something a little more complex, like like humans are more inclined to eat red lollipops than blue lollipops. Um, and so by stating that assumption, whether it's true or not, it's usually one that is true, and it's usually one that the reader has. And then by challenging that assumption, which they do later on, it helps the reader realize that the author is able to kind of change their own belief, and thus it adds credibility to the author's argument.
So another thing you can talk about is the anecdote, and an anecdote is basically where the author talks about a little story that usually they witnessed or they've heard about or that actually happened to them, in which case that would be called a personal anecdote. So the purpose of an anecdote or a story is to illustrate how their argument might manifest itself in real situations. So you might have all this theoretical talk about a stance or these certain sort of ideals or laws or anything like sort of freedom of speech, and you might be talking about all these big lofty things, and it's really theoretical, but the author might sort of give you a little story that happens to highlight an issue they're talking about. It could be the anecdote could highlight how something's failing and it's not working, and they might be arguing for a change, or they might give an anecdote of, look how great this is, and this is only great because this exists, and they might be arguing that we should improve something already existing. So the purpose of bringing an anecdote in, which in essence is just really a story or a little snapshot of something that has in fact happened, the author is giving you an example or an instance of a time when their argument might actually be relevant, and it lets the reader sort of have a better grasp on what the argument actually might look like and how it might actually impact their own life.
So another one is rhetorical questions. That's when the author asks a question in their passage that they don't really want answered. So that could be something like, how could a government do this to their people? And they're not really wondering, is it possible for the government to actually do this? What they're really saying is like, isn't it so awful that the government can do this to their people? Or isn't it so wonderful that the government can do this to their people? The tone of the question depends on the context that it's in. So you just need to make sure that you understand the passage so you kind of understand what the author intends when these rhetorical questions come up. But essentially, they're an effective way to really emphasize a point that the author is trying to make. And so the reader will see that the reader will see what the important points of the author's argument are.
Another thing you can talk about is the hypothetical situation. This is a lot like the anecdote, except that it actually hasn't happened yet, or it hasn't happened. And the author might be asking the reader to imagine a world where something is like this, and then they might give you a hypothetical example of what might something look like if this is implemented or if something isn't implemented. Usually You'll find very positive hypothetical situations where their argument sort of has succeeded. They're like, look, this is what our world could be like. Look at how great it is, and this is only possible if my stance or if whatever I'm trying to argue happens or comes true or succeeds. And this allows the reader to be like, oh man, like imagine like, wow, that's actually such a great potential future. I would want that. And they use that sort of feeling of, wow, that's so great, to sort of spur readers into action or to get readers to agree with them on an issue. On the flip side, they could also present a really disastrous situation where they might say, if we don't take action now, our world is going to be a wasteland where no one can live. And again, it spurs the reader into action because the reader is forced to think about what might be if they don't address the issue in their passage. So the author would be manipulating a more negative emotional response, but the effect is the same, which is that the reader becomes motivated to agree or to join their cause or to sort of believe in the author. And the only difference between the anecdote and the hypothetical situation is that anecdotes happen, and often they're personal anecdotes that the author, him or herself, has experienced, whereas hypothetical situations are purely hypothetical, so they haven't happened yet or they did not happen in the past.
So appeal to identity is one where the author kind of assumes that they share something in common with their readers. So that could be something like Americans, or it could be citizens, humans, high school students. What they're trying to do is just invoke a sense of togetherness, that the reader feels like they are also part of the author's argument, that they are directly affected by whatever the author is trying to argue. And that mainly goes hand in hand with the next element, actually, which is.
Okay, so the next one is strong directives with the collective pronoun we. Whenever you see an author use we, so the first person plural pronoun, they're putting themselves on the same side as their audience. And often, like Crystal was talking about, they're going to be using a shared identity. So often you'll see this in speeches where politicians will say, we need to do something, or we as Americans, we as citizens, we as people, and they sort of use this unifying sort of feeling, and they play on that to say, look, I'm on your side. I want what's best for us, which is what's best for you. And by using the we, it makes the reader more likely to believe the author because it gives them a sense that they're sort of on the same side, and whatever the author wants is what the reader should also want.
So another one is appeal to emotion. That's kind of similar to hypothetical situations where the author wants the reader to feel a certain way. Essentially, that's just to manipulate the reader's emotions, but that can be done through a variety of ways. So that could be done through an anecdote, or it could be done through their word choice, or it could be done through juxtaposition, or any of the other elements that we've listed previously. Appeal to emotion can be a little bit more broad. And it essentially does the same thing as those other ones. It just wants to make the reader feel in a certain way, which in turn helps the author's argument and then causes the reader to be more convinced as well.
Okay, another one you can use is results from research or studies. This is pretty similar to statistics and data, but it doesn't have to be pure numbers. It could be something as simple as studies show that when on the couch, people are more likely to eat food. And you can use this statement, you can talk about how the author uses this statement, because again, it's sort of the same logic. They're sort of supporting their argument with scientific evidence or research or results that typically people are more inclined to believe because they trust in sort of scientific method, and it's they have actually something to ground their argument in, and they're not sort of just making an empty argument. They're actually founding it in something that has been proven or has been supported by science. And I think that's all we have for the elements, but before we move on to questions, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who has donated to the MGH. I really appreciate it, no matter what amount. And we've decided to continue holding sessions. So next Sunday, we will have a high school junior. His name is Patrick Liu, and he got a full score first try on the Math 2 subject test. If you're interested in signing up, you can find that on my website or on the MGH fundraiser page. They all direct you to the same form where you can input your email to sign up for that. And it'll happen next Sunday, again at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So tune in if you want to hear some advice and experience from Patrick about the Math 2. It's a very common subject test that a lot of, or I want to say that almost most high school students take, because there's the Math 1 and the Math 2, and typically if you're looking to do anything sort of potentially STEM related in college, you should take the Math 2 subject test. So yeah, now we have time for questions. So you can put them in the chat box and you can address them to either Crystal or me. Otherwise, we'll just take turns answering your questions. And I will stop sharing this screen. Okay. So will we have sessions next Sunday? Yes, the Math 2 is happening next Sunday at the same time. Is a 5-paragraph structure mandatory or just a good suggestion? So nothing is mandatory. You won't find anything really on the College Board website other than what we showed for you with the 444 rubric, but it's like strongly recommended. If you don't do a 5-paragraph structure, I feel like that's just not a good idea. If you do find that you can't really pull together 3 major points, you can get a 4-paragraph structure where you have 2 body paragraphs, but I really don't recommend that.
Can we look back at the presentation through a link or something? Yes, Tina's actually going to upload the whole screen capture of this whole session onto her YouTube, which I think you will have on your website.
Yes, I will. So it will be on YouTube and you can watch the whole thing, and you can also listen to us talk about it if you want to go back to some sections.
Do you have a recommended reading list? I don't know about Tina, but I personally, all of these essays are going to be persuasive in nature. So you want to make sure that you're reading opinion pieces. So the New York Times, Washington Post, any reputable newspaper, if you just go to their opinion sections and try to find op-eds, so opinion editorials, those are good places to start. They might be a little longer than what you're used to or what the SAT will give you, but you'll be able to identify the author's argument, and you'll be able to identify what rhetorical strategies they're using. So essentially just any credible sources publishing opinionated pieces, those are all fine for practice.
Did you guys take AP Lang before or during studying the SAT? How similar is the rhetorical analysis essay from AP Lang to the SAT essay? So Crystal and I both took both AP Literature and Composition and AP Language and Composition. We both got 5s. We took that at the end of our junior year, which means we actually took the SAT essay before, or is that true for you?
Before, summer before.
Yeah, and do you want to talk about the rhetorical analysis essay? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. The rhetorical analysis essay on AP Lang, at least the prompt that we got was to argue about an unpopular opinion, and that's not quite the same as the SAT essay. Honestly, the SAT essay is something that you'll come across once when you take the SAT, and then you'll never write an essay like it ever again. It's not something that you'll ever write during your English classes. It's not something that you'll really ever see by anyone who actually wants to look at good writing. But it's necessary for you when you take the test, so unfortunately you've got to study for it. The difference is that the AP Language asks you to argue for something that you believe in, or something, yeah, the argument comes from you, and so the structure might be similar, a 5-paragraph essay, but it's all your ideas. The SAT essay is you have to argue how convincing someone else's argument is. And that's a very important distinction. You basically essentially have to analyze the essay, the passage that you're given for the rhetorical techniques that the author uses. Not so much like whether you agree with the author or whether you don't agree or what suggestions you have to make the author's argument better. It's not about that.
Right, you can't talk about sort of how the author didn't persuade you or how it's not persuasive. You have to kind of assume that the author is persuading their audience, and you're talking about how they're doing that. So that's a very important assumption that you have to sort of make in your writing. Is the prompt always to analyze someone else's argument? Yes, it's always going to be that same that prompt that we showed you at the beginning, where it's like write an essay in which you analyze the authors, how the author argues this. So the argument will change based on the passage you'll be given, but you'll literally see the exact wording in the question on the day of the test. So it's always going to be the same.
How many practice tests did you guys do to get more familiar with the essay? I don't know about Tina. I don't think I did a single practice test, which you definitely should try to do if you are familiar with it. It's just that at the school that we go to, I was very used to doing timed essay writing things, and so I didn't feel that the SAT essay was something super difficult to do or something that I particularly needed extra practice on. I focused a little bit more on my other aspects of the SAT in my studying. But you should definitely try to honestly take just every single practice test that the SAT offers, because that's the most authentic source. So so I think there's 8, so you can just take 8 essays at the end, and there actually might be some more for now, but there were 8 when we
Yeah,
took.
I did a little, I think I did about 3 to 5, which is, more than Crystal, but less than the amount of practice tests I took to study for the general part of the SAT. So usually if you're sort of choosing between essay or general, you probably want to spend more time studying for the general SAT, because typically people find that to be more important. And I yeah, I did about 3 to 5. I just wanted to get a feel for what it would be like to sort of handwrite, because I wasn't used to that. Like Crystal said, we're trained to do we were trained to do a lot of essays under a time crunch, so I wasn't too concerned about that. But if you don't have experience doing that, I would recommend doing quite a few practice tests just to get the hang of how you actually write and operate under a time like constraint, because you have a lot less time to sort of consider how you want to phrase something or how you want to set up your essay. How do you suggest we grade our practice essays? I know that Khan Academy has a feature where you can sort of plug in your essay and they'll give you a rough estimate of what grade you might get, but it's completely done by a computer. So it's honestly not very reliable. It's just the computer is looking for certain phrases that you should have pulled out from the passage. So I'm not sure that that is the best place to go to, but it's better than nothing. Honestly, the best way I think to get better at writing is to have someone grade or look at your essay, someone who is a advanced writer or is very familiar with SAT essay, to actually look at your essay and give you feedback.
The ACT essay requires you to analyze and evaluate multiple perspectives. Are these tips and elements applicable to the ACT as well? I would assume so. I don't have experience with the ACT, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the biggest change or the difference would just be the structure of your essay. You wouldn't argue just 3 perspectives. Maybe each body paragraph is 3 elements. Maybe each body paragraph is a different perspective instead. That depends more on what the ACT exactly is asking for. And I just don't know enough, unfortunately, to
Yeah,
give you an.
I didn't take the ACT, so I can't really offer super relevant advice. Do you recommend having different aspects of rhetoric, EX, a combination of stats, appeal to emotion, juxtaposition, or similar areas of rhetoric? Honestly, you will find that you won't have too much to choose from. Typically, in a passage, you might only find, I would say, like 2 to 4 or 2 to 3 really strong sort of elements that you can write about, and that's all you're going to be limited to. So you don't have to think about that, because what you're going to be given is basically a very short chunk where you only have basically 3 things to choose from. And if you have to choose between aspects, I would again recommend choosing the most sort of frequently occurring sort of element, because it means that it's more relevant and it's more prominent in the passage. So you want to talk about that more. If you find that the author is sort of using statistics and data like almost every other sentence, you definitely want to talk about statistics and data. Whereas if they only have one rhetorical question, I would avoid talking about rhetorical questions, because that's sort of a one instance kind of thing. And you want to be talking about how elements sort of work to advance their argument. So you want to be talking about how an element works in multiple places to actually advance the author's argument.
Yeah. What's a good way to end the essay? Should I say I prove my argument or connect it with another idea from the passage? Well, you have to remember it's not so much your argument, but more the author's argument. So what you actually want to do is literally just restate whatever your thesis was. So if my thesis was something like the authors blank and blank effectively prove their claim that whatever the claim is through a mix of X, Y, and Z, whatever the three elements were, and that would be enough. And then in my conclusion, I'd say something like, through the use of X, Y, and Z, the authors effectively convince the readers of their claim, and that would be it. It's a bit repetitive, but that's all that College Board wants to see from you.
Yeah, typically your conclusion will probably sound like a restatement of your thesis. That's generally what it looks like. Okay, are there any more questions? If not, thanks for showing up, and that'll be the end of our SAT essay session. Again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for everyone who donated to MGH. All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.